Hey, welcome to the Healthy Postnatal Body Podcast with your postnatal expert, Peter Lapp. That, as always, will be me. I hope you're well. I hope you're doing great. This, my friends, is the podcast for the 6th of March 2022. And I just said the date before the music starts, so that means I have another guest on. And boy, oh boy, do I have a good guest on. Danielle Sullivan, who's a neurodiversity, easier said than done, life coach, an autism and disability advocate, and an autistic mother, a mother who happens to be autistic. She also has kids who are neurodivergent, and this is one of those interviews that I wanted to do for a long time. We're talking everything to do with raising kids who happen to be neurodivergent. What is it? Autism, ADHD, all that sort of fun stuff. What is it? What works? What doesn't? I swear I learned more in this hour than I could have done doing 10 or 20 hours of research on Google. Danielle has so much knowledge and is so articulate and shares it so very, very well that I was delighted she came on to talk to me about this. It's a great interview. I had great fun recording this one. So without further ado, let's get cracking, right? Here we go. So say you're a parent whose child has just been diagnosed as autistic or having ADHD. What's the first thing you should know?
Well, I think the first thing you should know is that this is just information, that when you get this diagnosis, you are just getting the information that your kiddo is autistic or ADHD or has a different neurotype. And what happens after that varies dramatically depending on your unique child. And so I think there is a tendency, especially if you're not familiar with autism or ADHD or whatever the neurodivergence is, to sort of panic and think, this is forever. This is, something I have to deal with right away. You have time. Your kiddo is fine. You have time. So don't panic and just start from the beginning with getting more information and learning more about whatever the diagnosis has come back as.
Yeah, because obviously the first time it's going to be, I'm guessing any diagnosis you get with regards to any child for any sort of, I don't like calling neurodiversity an illness because it isn't really, or not necessarily anyways. But it falls out with the parameters of what we expect when we're going to have babies. We expect our babies to have 2 legs, 2 arms, 10 little fingers, and to be, air quotes, have normal development.
Yeah.
And anything outside that is likely to be slightly scary because it's unexpected. And like you said, it's quite funny that you say, if you're unfamiliar with ADHD or autism or neurodivergent, I think that's the vast majority of us are not that familiar with it. If we're completely honest, I know I'm not, and I have a nephew that is on the spectrum somewhere, but I'm still not that familiar. So yeah. So what do you say?
Yeah. So I have a couple of things. The first is just to kind of define language that a lot of times that sort of normal, quote unquote, that you're talking about, we call neurotypical, which just means you have typical neurology, right? And then neurodivergent would be some other kind of neurotype like autism, ADHD, bipolar, whatever. And that when you first get that diagnosis, it can be really scary and really challenging. But neurodiversity is actually really normal in humans, that we have between 1 in 4 and 1 in 10 people are neurodivergent. Not everybody has been caught by the systems and identified. I'm late identified. A lot of my family is. The other thing is neurodiversities are just sets of traits. They're ways that people think a little bit differently than neurotypicals do. And traits are passed down in families. And so if your kiddo has been diagnosed ADHD or autistic, you and your partner may or may not be, but you probably have some traits from that's kind of normal for that profile. And so it's not going to be as different or strange or whatever you're worried about, it's not going to be as much like that as you think it might be, right? Your kiddo might have a different neurotype, but some of that stuff is going to be in your family history already. So it's not coming out of nowhere, you'll recognize like that weird thing your father does in your kiddo and be like, oh, that's what's going on.
Oh, that's what it is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because this the neurodivergent thing is not really. I'm from the Netherlands, and so it might be different in the UK and the US. But my dad's generation was different. As in, no one of my dad's generation was diagnosed autistic. Or diagnosed. Asperger's wasn't even a thing. It just didn't exist. ADHD definitely didn't exist. It was just you had people who paid attention and you had people who didn't pay attention. And you had the R word, right? Which were obviously, but that was the only mental illness. Again, a massive air quotes here because I know it's not, and I don't want to upset anyone. But from my dad's generation, that was it. There wasn't anything there. Whereas, of course, it's exactly like what you said. If I have various friends and families where you can just see it down the line. Granddad was exactly the same as the 5-year-old is.
Yeah.
His granddad didn't have a name for it. He was just antisocial, or slightly off, as they used to call it.
Yeah. So what's really excellent about having the diagnosis is, again, it's just information. It gives you a way to think through and frame those behaviors and those traits in a way that can be positive. So like I'm autistic, so I definitely fall in that what would traditionally be called antisocial bracket, right? Where I don't like being busy for no reason. I don't like people talking to me with no purpose, right? So I'm not the person to sit and talk about the weather with, or talk about the game last week. But because I know that about myself, I can kind of use my time better, build relationships better. So instead of forcing myself through that social small talk with people I really care about, I can be upfront and say, listen, like you'll lose me really fast and I'll waste a lot of energy doing this with you. Could we talk about something that's actually important in the world? Because that's just my brain. And so having that information about the neurodiversity in your family just gives you opportunities to really connect with one another in ways that really matter, as opposed to just kind of doing it the way it's always been done, right? And I think that there's pros and cons to the kind of current diagnosis trend where, like you said, the granddad might have just been called antisocial in the past. And so he wouldn't have had to deal with the kind of stigma of diagnosis that can come along with a mental health diagnosis or a neurodiversity diagnosis. But also he might have felt like he didn't belong, or like he couldn't communicate with his family, or like people just didn't get him. And having that diagnosis and that information can really help, especially kiddos, feel like they belong in this world and like their family understands them. And it gives you that starting point for moving forward with the conversation that I just think is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that absolutely. And it allows you to, especially when we're dealing with kids, because there have been a lot of adults in the news in the UK recently, relatively famous people who are late diagnosed as having some sort of neurodivergent. And they say it's been very liberating for them. Rather than being negative, it's all been positive for them, because they're like, this makes sense. And I am not, for want of a better word, I'm not an asshole. I can't put up with all the small, especially in the UK, we talk about the weather for pretty much an hour every day. All day, every day. You kind of have to do
It's very common in the US too.
Exactly. You just say, dude, I just don't have time for this. Right? That sort of thing. But for kids especially, I suppose having an earlier diagnosis will allow you to tailor their education and their socializing and all that completely differently than you would. It would maybe stop you forcing them to do the things that, other kids all do.
Yes. And so, every child is an individual and unique, and you're going to, as a parent, do the best thing you can for your kiddo. But if you know that your child is, for example, autistic, you might recognize that maybe they don't want to be as social. Maybe it's okay that they just have one friend and not a huge friend group.
Mhm.
Maybe going out every day is really too intense for them, or maybe doing traditional schooling or conventional schooling is too intense for them, or maybe they need some extra time to kind of do this emotional processing. Maybe they need some more support around language or emotional processing. And so again, the diagnosis is really just information that gives you a way forward with your kiddo. And I think that it's also really important as a parent, if you get that information, to find other people in your community. Again, it's like 1 in 10 people are neurodivergent, at least over here in the US. And I don't uh, think that it changes too dramatically depending on where in the world you are. And so, like, there are other people with autistic or ADHD kids in your community, and certainly online. you know,
Oh,
so
absolutely, yes.
find your favorite social platform, find other adults who have kids that age, and see what they're doing and what they recommend, and make some community yourself that way.
Yeah, because of course, same for parents of neurodivergent kids. It's the same as for any parent. Your support network is everything, right? Let's be honest.
Absolutely.
When you just become a parent, you know nothing. You think you know everything before you have kids, and you know nothing as soon as you actually
You get
have
knocked
kids.
over. Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, so just to bring it back to basics a little bit for a
Mhm.
lot of my listeners, because a lot of my listeners will go, yeah, neurodivergence all well and good. Autism, but what's the difference between autism and Asperger's,
Sure.
autism, ADHD, and all that? Because there, it's not like there is just one way of being neurodivergent, right? It's not
Nope.
autism and that's it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a huge variety. So I can say, so I'm an autistic person, and I have autism and ADHD in my family. So I can talk about autism first. Autism varies widely.
Mhm.
There's a huge range of traits associated with autism, um, and Asperger's is really just an older word that's kind of fallen out of vogue lately
Okay.
for autism that doesn't require high support. So when we talk about autistics, some of us have what's called low support needs. We don't need a lot of interventions. We're mostly okay, like day to day,
Hmm.
in functioning like a neurotypical person. And then we have high support needs, and those are autistics who maybe need communication support, day to day living skills support. Sometimes there's intellectual disability related. And so there's a huge range of us. And the folks, when you were talking about like, 20, 40 years ago, autism wasn't a thing. That's because the high support needs people were, at least in the United States and in Europe, mostly kind of
Hmm.
institutionalized, like
Yeah.
in group homes. And the low supports needs people, like the granddad, were just sort of that oddball,
Hmm.
slightly slightly
Yeah.
asshole person, right? Like me, I'm the oddball, slightly asshole person. So because I'm just an autistic, my social knowledge is still pretty low. So, and then ADHD, that stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And
Mhm.
there's a whole bunch of different people grouped under this label. And I suspect in the next 10, 20 years, we'll have types of
Right.
ADHD. And we're just still working on that. And that tends to look like somebody who's, and again, there's huge variety, but somebody who is, quote, inattentive, who's daydreamy, who's in their own brain, who maybe flits from one type of interest to another, who has trouble sitting still for long. Though sometimes they're not, a lot of ADHDers aren't caught until they're older because they're not actually hyperactive. They're just sort of daydreamy. But
Right.
if that typical sort of stereotypical little boy who runs around a lot and can't focus on anything and
Hmm.
can't sit still, that's sort of stereotypical ADHD, right? But in reality, there's a huge range. And so again, like, and there are autistics who are also ADHD. There are people who are completely separate. So we're talking about them like this monolith group, but really it's like there's a quote in autism circles that's like, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And it's a play on, there is no autism
Yeah.
that you can just immediately identify as like, this is what autism looks like. It's like, it's so varied and so diverse. It's really fun to start digging into it. Yeah.
Yeah, because because from a layman's, and as I point this out on almost any podcast where I interview an expert, where I just go, I'm a middle-aged white guy. And, the world knows we know nothing, right? We have all the confidence of someone who knows nothing, but we know nothing. So I am from a different, let's say, generation. So a lot of the language that is being used these days and is not the language I was raised with. And I'm 47. I'm on the youngish end of the. I'm not 65-year-old Republican GOP sort of guy. I'm just saying I'm middle-aged white guy. So sometimes I get my language wrong. But from what I see, what a lot of people think is autism. They think Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. ADHD. They think, hey, look, a squirrel.
Yes.
Right. And it's interesting that you say there's so much more to it, because we know there's a spectrum and all that sort of stuff. And like I said, my nephew is on the far end of he's 5 years old now, or something like that, and he just said his first word. He's on that level of the thing. He's not really verbal. That doesn't mean he doesn't communicate. He just does it in his own way, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you say, no, there are so many more varieties, because it kind of then all comes down to, actually, we now know Greta Thunberg as well, right? And it all comes down to, as long as we treat people as individuals, we will be okay, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
Yes, but I also think that there is at least, well, this might be blatantly American, so you can call me on it. But over here, there is the tendency to want to treat people in this very kind of individualistic way, where we're all responsible for ourselves. We all have to do it by ourselves. And you want to treat people like you would treat you. And in reality, a lot of neurodivergent people have different support needs. Need maybe more recuperative time. We tend to be slower processors of information. So we dig deeper. We process, we can, how do I want to say it? An autistic person will take 3 times as long at doing a job as a neurotypical, but will produce a 3 times more complex piece at the end. And that's not positive or negative, right? Like, it depends on what you're aiming for. It's just a difference. And so we can't always be treated the way we would like others to be treated, or we can't always be treated the way you would treat your, because we do have different needs. And so there's this sort of middle ground of trying to recognize that we have value and we can contribute, whether we can speak or not, whether we're verbal or not, whether we're high or low support needs, all this kind of stuff. But also that we might need you to treat us a little differently in order to, especially, again, to bring it back to parents of very small children, right? Like you said, if your nephew didn't speak until he was 5, and he might be low verbal, that's relatively common in the autism community. I didn't talk till late. My son didn't talk till very late. We're both relatively verbal now, but we will shut down when we get overwhelmed. So I will go from being a roughly capable looking person who can be interviewed on a podcast to someone who is not speaking for a couple of hours. And that's normal in my life and in the life of a lot of autistics, but it looks very different to a neurotypical in terms of what you would expect. And so again, doing your research, and if you have a kiddo who's just been identified, reading, learning from the community, talking to other parents can give you a new understanding of what's normal or what's kind of reasonable in terms of neurodivergent traits to expect. And then you don't, punish your child for not being able to talk or something like that. But like, a lot of times we have an assumption in our head about what, like you were saying, you have an assumption when you become a parent that your child will be born with 10 fingers, 10 toes, neurotypical, right? And getting that getting that diagnosis means that you have to change your own assumptions about your kiddo. Your kiddo is still perfect, but you as a parent have to do some work to change around what you expect from them and what you think they are capable of. They are still highly capable. I
Mm.
promise you, even folks with high support needs are extremely capable in lots of ways. But you as a parent might need to do some work about, well, do we have to expect them to be able to speak all the time? Do we expect them to be able to change their plans at the drop of a hat? That's something that my family completely struggles with.
Mhm.
There's a lot of anxiety about changing routines and changing expectations, and we need extra time to process stuff like that. So again, it's kind of the work of the parent to do the research and figure out, well, which of these traits applies to my kiddo and what can I be doing to make their life a little easier, because they're already in a world that doesn't really get them.
Mm.
And so we, at least as the parents, want to do our best to get them and really be there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you say with regards to the individualistic approach, because what I like to think is that we start treating people the way they would like to be treated, rather than the way I would like to be treated myself.
Yes.
And I think there's a slight difference between the two.
It's like a step up.
Yeah, it's like do unto others, right? That I'm completely on board with. Don't do to other people what you wouldn't like done to yourself. I'm completely on board with that. But treat others the way they like to be treated, I think, is probably let's say it's not really kinder. It just seems to be more sensible.
I agree with you. It's like a more human, ethical way to approach things. I also just think it's hard. It does put the burden of, so especially as a parent, right? Your kiddo is doing the best they can, is learning the world, is learning all these skills, when they're very, very young. And if they're autistic or ADHD or any other neurodivergent, that they may be learning differently than neurotypical kids. And I just don't think it should be on the burden of us as neurodivergent people to always be the communicators or the people who are, like, your kiddo shouldn't have to explain to you as the parent what they need. Sometimes that will happen, right? Like that, there's normal communication. But in terms of general needs, like it's kind of your job as the parent, and it's hard, but it's your job to do the emotional intelligence work and the research to say, oh, I recognize this is like slow processing. They need more time. I'm going to build more time into their schedule, right? Or I recognize it's hard for them to talk at this time. And so I'm going to build in ways to reduce their speaking load. Or, it's really hard for them to make decisions. This was a big one with my daughter. Total decision fatigue, overwhelm all the time.
Right.
And we made a bunch of visual cues around the house. We put up pictures of things. We gave her a menu of pictures to choose from for food, right? And that's kind of putting the burden back on you as a parent to reduce burden for your kiddo. So I do encourage parents to think about it as like a two-way street, right? You teaching your kid to communicate what they need, but also you have to be a little on top of it and really flexible in your approach to parenting when you have a neurodivergent kiddo.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I was listening to The Problem with Jon Stewart, the podcast edition, because I don't pay for Apple TV because I'm cheap. And he was making a very similar point on a completely different subject. He was talking about Black Lives Matter and how people of color have had the same conversation with white people, and again, middle-aged white guy, for the past 60, 70, 80, 90, actually 100 years. He said, maybe it's time for, instead of saying, I'm a white guy, I will sit down and have the people of color or black people, whatever you want to call it, depending on the country where you are.
Exactly.
Different terms are acceptable. So I always like to point that out on the podcast. It's instead of me going, explain it to me again, no, there's explanation fatigue. That's it.
Yeah.
I've already explained this to you. You should have the thought process between yourselves for now. And it's the same. I suppose as a parent, you are the adult. At the end of the day, you are still the adult in the relationship. Yes. And therefore the onus is kind of still on you to find maybe a different path to get whatever result. If you want your kids to eat the greens or to eat their veggies, maybe find a different path to get that done other than the shouting, which also never worked on me as a kid, to be honest. But
yeah, and I'm into collaborative parenting, so I'm super biased in that direction. But I also honestly think that's a style that tends to work best for neurodivergent kiddos, because a lot of us have certain psychological traits that just don't respond well to the traditional kind of authoritarian parenting model. And so I could go on a whole tangent there.
Yeah, no, please. Because the temptation is, of
Mhm.
course, to raise your kids the way you yourself were raised,
Mhm.
hopefully in a slightly better way. As
Yeah.
one of my clients always pointed out, it's be slightly better than your parents were, and you'll be a great parent.
Yeah.
That's kind of all you can hope for.
Mhm.
However, I'm fairly sure, and I'm not saying anything against my parents, but they would not have dealt well with the way they were raising kids at the time,
Mhm.
with a narrow, if I'd been neurodivergent to the extent that it had caused me, if it had meant that they had to stop shouting at me, that would
Yeah.
have been a problem. Again,
Mhm.
different generation, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not judging the parent, but that's the way. You have to really then find a new way and learn completely new skills, don't you?
Yes. And it can be really vulnerable as a parent because, especially I can speak for myself. I am a late diagnosed autistic adult. I was
Mhm.
diagnosed after my first child uh,
Right?
was diagnosed for autism, and he was 2.5.
Mhm.
Um, and then within, the next year, it was like, oh, clearly Danielle was so autistic. And then I had my daughter, who is oh, the epitome of an ADHDer, just extremely ADHD in all
Right.
ways. And she's wonderful, but she needs they both need different parenting approach. Like each child needs a distinct
Mm.
parenting approach. And it took so long and it was so much work to figure that out. But also it really introduced a lot of vulnerability to me and my partner as parents, because again, you have a baby and you think, oh, okay, this is going to be new and it's going to be
Mhm.
different, but you're not really prepared. Like you're just never really prepared. And through trial and error, you really have to come to terms with, well, how was I raised and what worked there and what didn't work and what do
Mm.
I want to do different? And I don't know, for me, I thought I'd done a lot of that work before I had the kid. And then it turned out first that I had not done as much as I thought, but second that the kid was a little different than I expected. And
Mhm.
he's amazing. And I'm so proud of both of my kiddos and I'm so grateful for them. But they really challenged me as a person
Mm.
to rethink what is important to me as a parent and what are my goals for my kiddos. Is it to, and each parent has different goals, and it's all also related to race and class and all these other things. And so, some people are going to say, well, the most important thing is my kid goes to college, and that's really important. For me, it's that my kids have kind of basic emotional intelligence skills, communication skills, and can stand up for themselves.
Mm.
And that's extra hard for neurodivergent kiddos in my experience. And so we do things very differently from a lot of other families just
Mhm.
to support those goals. We let a lot of things go that other families might not want to let go. And the way our houses and our household and our parenting our child relationship is structured looks really different than a lot of other people's relationships. I don't think it's better or worse, but
Mhm.
it really has to be for neurodivergent kids. You're not going to be able to do as much, and you're not going to be able to get away with as much as a parent as you can for a lot of neurotypical
Yeah.
kids. And so you really have to be on it. Like you have to know exactly what your goal is and what you're aiming for and let everything else drop in my, that's just my personal experience. But it's when I work with clients, a lot of times parents just have these preconceived ideas about how they're going to parent,
Mm.
and they can tell it's not working, but they haven't quite gotten to the point where they realize they have to change what they're doing. It's not the kid. The kid is doing the best they can. Always, always, always,
Mhm.
100% of the time. Kids want to be good kids. But parents have the job of tweaking what they're doing to help their kiddo. And
Mhm.
it's hard. It's really hard. Yeah.
But that's the thing. That's why it's called parenting, right?
Yeah.
That's the verb in the
Mhm.
in the relationship.
Mhm.
It's interesting when you say you're now every like you said earlier on, every child is different, right?
Yeah.
And we accept that. However, when you say your son is completely different, completely neurodivergent from your daughter,
Mhm.
how do you then deal with, and maybe this isn't an issue, but how do you deal with the fairness principle?
Yeah.
because the only arguments I ever had was my brother is a couple of years younger than I am. And I see this in other relationships, other parenting relationships where there's more than one child. It's the, but he got to, or but she got to.
Yeah.
And that must be a very tricky thing to overcome.
Yeah. So there are I have a couple of brain. So I guess what I would say, a couple of things, is first that in our household, we try to talk a lot about equity versus equality. And that, equality is the idea of you get 50%, I get 50%, it's equal, we're good. Where equity is based on that we divide our, what's the word? Our things, our stuff.
Resources, yeah.
Resources, thank you. Yes. I could not generate it. There's the autism for you. Sometimes the word just goes. We divide our resources based on what is needed by each person. And so, if we divide by 50-50, but you make more than me, that's equal, but it's not equitable, right? Yeah. And so when you have kids who have different needs, we work really hard on the empathy piece and saying, well, what, if your brother is hypersensitive to sound, or I'm hypersensitive to sound, it's not equal if we all, get to run around the room screaming all the time. That's not healthy for the people who live in this house. And so we're dividing our quiet time and our loud time based on who needs what, or we're dividing. I know the more traditional thing is like, the food, right? The candy or whatever, right? Who needs it more that day? And the other thing is that in my experience, when kids are sort of pitting against each other, they're saying he got more than me, she got more than me. What they're really often asking for is the resource of time from you as the parent, or attention from you as a parent. So a kid who is secure that they're always going to get enough is going to be more likely to be generous. And we're like my kids very often, and I don't know, I think this is them and not specifically my parenting, but they'll very often go out of their way to make sure the other kid has the same things they do. Sharing, they'll split their little gummy bears in half and stuff. And I think that's partly because they know that they're going to get what they need from me and their dad and from each other, that we're going to prioritize their comfort and safety and well-being. As best we can. Obviously comfort is a little bit mixed because we live in the world and, it is what it is. But in terms of sensory overwhelm and stuff that's relative to neurodivergence, we, prioritize comfort. And so as a parent, a lot of the work I do is checking in with my kids individually, making sure they have one-on-one time with me, with their dad, one-on-one time with each other, and that they feel like they're getting what they need. Because then they'll tell me if they're not, and they're less likely to go poke their brother about something being, quote, unfair. Because usually it's not actually the candy they're worried about. It's like a more meta, like I'm scared that I won't get what I need in the world kind of feeling. So, yeah.
So do you have to, I suppose, again, this kind of makes sense to, but sometimes I like people to just say it out loud, so to speak. The conversations you have with your son, do they have to be fundamentally different from the conversations you have with your daughter? As in, when you have two neurotypical kids, and one is 12 and one is 14, then one is older than the other, and one is maybe a different sex and different gender from the other, but fundamentally you can have a similar chat with them. Yeah. To explain a concept of whatever, bedtime or appointments or whatever, do you have to have a completely different approach with your daughter who has ADHD than you do, say, with your son?
I think the kind of script for our conversations is very similar in terms of the actual information I'm giving them. But the way that I check in with them and the way I make sure they're actually hearing me is different.
Right.
Because the ADHDer is really, and this is a common ADHD trait. My co-parent does this too, where you tell them a thing and they say, okay, and they seem like they got it. And it is not in their brain. It just went out. And that's not something that they can really control. What you can do, and there's some things, but there are some things you can do to sort of mitigate that. And so one of the things we do is Like I'll make sure she's not in the middle of something. I'll walk up to her. I'll say, can I talk to you? And she'll say yes or no. If she says no, we honor that. We come back later. If she says yes, she puts down her stuff. She looks at me. I get really close to her. I touch her if it's reasonable. And we're like together.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, I want to talk to you about, the thing. Here are my ideas. What do you think? Wait for her feedback. Sometimes she'll say, I said we could talk about this now, but actually I don't think I'm here. Can we talk about it later? And again, we honor that. We go back, come back later. But if she has, an opinion, she'll tell me. And then usually I'll check in again a couple more times throughout the day or the week or whatever time frame, and just be like, remember, we talked about this. We agreed this. Still good. Because again, slow processing is a piece with ADHD that sometimes, like, initially it sounded like a good idea, but the more we think about it, we're like, oh, actually, I see all these problems. And for my son, I do something similar, but he is honestly a little bit more trustworthy. He has the autistic brain of, you tell him something one time and he will remember it for a million years. Like, it will never leave. So he hyper focuses. He has a lot of special interests. So with him, it's more about just getting his attention the one time, making sure he actually heard me, and then maybe checking in like half as often as I do with my daughter. And I should say for listeners, if it's relevant, that my kids are a little older than your kids maybe. I have an almost 9 and almost 7-year-old. So they do have a lot more communication skills at this age. But we've also practiced communication a lot, because when they get overwhelmed, those skills just drop, and they still need to be able to tell me why they're overwhelmed. And so, it's taken a lot of work to get to that point. It has not been easy, but yeah.
I suppose one of the interesting bits that you mentioned there is you're very respectful of the boundaries that your kids are able to express to you. So you must have spent a lot of time with your daughter, for instance, saying things like, it is okay for you to say when you're not available for a conversation, when you're not in the moment, or whatever you want to call it, when you're not really there, when you're in your own world, or whatever it is. That must have taken a bit of time to get to that point.
Absolutely. I think boundaries are really important for neurodivergent people to instill in our kids, and also for ourselves to have. If anybody listening to this happens to be neurodivergent, there is a common concern for neurodivergent kids, is that they will be required or requested to assimilate into the kind of neurotypical norms, right? We have social norms, cultural norms, the way we speak, the way we talk, the way we gesture, how our eye contact is. There's all these things that you probably don't think about, that you do every day, that show that you're neurotypical. And a lot of your autistic ADHD friends are faking it, faking neurotypicality in a lot of places, it's usually called masking, if you want to Google it, because sometimes it's just not possible or safe or reasonable for us to be authentically autistic or authentically ADHD, right? But that takes a huge toll. It is exhausting, and it is not good for us in the long term. And since I have 2 neurodivergent kids, I recognize that they will have to mask sometimes. They will have to go out into the world and kind of fake being neurotypicals. But I want them to be able to know what their boundaries are, and to state them to anybody. And I think that starts at home. If they can't tell me that this is not a good time to talk, how are they going to tell their boyfriend, their boss, their whoever in the future? And it also encourages their sort of own emotional intelligence, that a lot of us are divorced from our feelings, because say a lot of autistics and ADHDers, when they're small children, are very intense, like highly intense, huge tantrums, especially kiddos who don't talk until later. We had tantrums with my daughter that lasted for hours of the day, because she was just emotionally overwhelmed all the time with sensory demands. And that will still exist in her as an adult. Like, those sensory challenges she might have ways to accommodate them, right? She might be able to reduce them, but they won't go away. And so for me, as a parent, it was really important to teach her some emotional regulation, but also recognizing when she's about to hit that wall. And if we mask all the time, we don't let ourselves recognize when we're
Oh,
about to hit a wall. We just, and instead we come home from where I used to come home in the evenings and just fall over and be in a dark room for 4 hours because I was so overwhelmed and I didn't understand what was happening. And I don't want that for my kids. So for me, doing this early work of really taking the time, going slow, giving them extra processing time, checking in a lot, and practicing communication skills, like healthy ones, and healthy emotional regulation skills, means that for me, I did my job as a parent, and they can go off into the world and engage in relationships and build, friendships and work relationships and everything, and be able to say, no, I don't want to do this, and not feel pressured by neurotypical society to just keep saying yes, 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 even when they're past their kind of emotional sensory boundaries. So kind of went in a
yeah.
circle there, but
No, no,
boundaries are really important for me. Really important for me. Yeah,
because
worth the work.
it all comes down to a little bit, for lack of a better word, and I know consent, doesn't it? It comes
Yes,
down to
for me.
teaching your kids what is okay and what isn't. So now, obviously, you mentioned that neurodivergence doesn't tend to fall out of the sky. Doesn't it tends to be passed on? Tends to be a as a how is life as a neurodivergent parent? Because I'm guessing when you're saying sensory overload and all that sort of stuff is a problem, screaming babies can't be easy.
Oh yeah, no, they're not. They're not easy. So I'm late diagnosed, which so I was caught. I was 32. I had to think about it for a minute when I had my son. So I started identifying and was diagnosed around 33, 34, I guess, when he was 2. And I think that's part of the reason that boundaries are so big for me, actually, is because I lived most of my life as one of those people who was just like, I don't fit in. Everything is hard. I don't understand what's going on. Why? And then when I got the autism diagnosis, like you were saying earlier in the episode, it was just like, oh, like this makes so much sense. Everything kind of, looking back in retrospect, everything kind of slots in. I suddenly feel like I have a reason for things and I understand why stuff has been difficult. And it's given me language to ask for what I need and create those boundaries and request, that I give my consent before people, expect things of me. But the first couple of years that my children were born were really hard because I still didn't really have that diagnosis. I didn't understand what had changed for me. I had coping mechanisms in place that were sort of haphazardly thrown together that had gotten me through 30 plus years. And then when my son was born and I stopped sleeping, as many new parents do, everything just fell apart. I had an awful postpartum experience. And he was a relatively, like in retrospect, knowing other babies now, and especially compared to my daughter, I love her. She was a hard baby. My son was a relatively easy baby. He did not sleep, but he was like cheery, happy, progressed relatively normally. We brought him in for diagnosis because he was speaking late. And he had a couple of developmental differences, but nothing that really made us very worried. So his diagnosis wasn't unexpected, but it was like also not a big deal for us. It was just like, oh, okay, that makes sense. For me, though, I was constantly overwhelmed with all the touch. I nursed both my kids till they were 4 each, and I'm proud of it, but it was probably not a good decision for my mental health. The noise was overwhelming. I own like 4 different kinds of earplugs just for different, but I didn't have those in place. The touch was overwhelming, the sound, the sleep deprivation was intense. And just like neurotypical people, neurodivergent people tend to have higher anxiety, higher depression, higher stress in general when we're not sleeping. Right. It was a really hard, probably the first 5 years of my son's life and my daughter getting to being verbal were the hardest points. Once my daughter got verbal, and she was early, I think she started speaking before my son did, and they're 2.5 years apart. But once she started talking, it was like, oh, okay, even though these conversations are kind of simple and she doesn't have all the vocabulary and complex emotional development yet, we can at least like talk about why we're having a 3-hour tantrum, right? Like what is going on? Because she had sensory overwhelm, and she had trouble with socks and shoes. She still has trouble with water sometimes. She doesn't like certain textures. And I also have all these problems. So this is not just her. This is definitely like my fault genetically. But there's a lot of kind of sensory challenges for her in her day-to-day life. And once she could tell me, this sock is making me crazy, please take it off, right? As a parent, that opened my world. That was like, okay, we can solve this problem, you know? But the first couple of years were hard. And in retrospect, if I'd known that I was autistic and if I'd been able to recognize sensory difficulties for what they were, I would have like probably not nursed, even though I'm, again, really proud of it. It was probably not worth it. I would have gotten more babysitters. I would have probably restructured work schedules with my co-parent, because I was home with the kids and he was working. That was just the way we were structured at the time. But I would have, we could have done a lot of things to support me and the kids better, but we just didn't know. So it was hard. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And that's part of why I do the work I do now, is like, trying to help other people get in front of it a little bit. So.
No, because that's the beauty of the thing now, I suppose. So what would you say to someone? So I mean, it's a stupid question. I'm thinking now that it really was. If the one thing people don't like to find out is whether they are, for want of a better word, either non-typical or ill. Right? And for a lot of people, and I'm not saying it's right, I'm saying that for a lot of people, this is probably still what it is. They consider autism, ADHD, any sort of neurodivergent to be an illness.
Yeah.
Right? They shouldn't, because it's just your wiring is slightly different, but you're not, it's not a disease in the same way that other things are that will actually make you ill. But people are always very reluctant to see a doctor anyways, right? Especially when they're thinking that there's nothing that wrong with me, or I know I feel slightly off. But if you're saying that it would have made such a big difference to have the diagnosis earlier to you, would you still recommend people go see their GP if they're like, listen, I might just be antisocial. However, there are some things, because I'm antisocial, as in I am not neurodivergent, I'm just antisocial. Or actually, one of my previous interviews I did with a lady who was talking about introvert and extrovert. And she explained it very clearly. She said, extroverted people get energy from other people. Introverted people, the energy is almost drained by other people. That's what I am. Right? Put me in a room with people for 4 hours and I'm out of there. I'm like, I need to be by myself for a few hours. Right? It's not that I don't enjoy these people's company, but there you go. But would you say, listen, if you feel you might be on the spectrum again, is that a phrase that we still use? It sounds like a strange phrase, but it's go talk to your doctor, go talk to your medical professional. And what is then the process of actually going to get the diagnosis?
Yeah. So I guess I have a couple of ideas. The first thing is, if you think that you might be neurodivergent, and you've, read around, Google, there's books, there's so many books now written by the one thing I would say is, although there is good information online from medical places and things like that, try to find people who actually have the neurodivergence that you think you have. If you might not know, and that's okay. But if you think, for example, that you might be autistic, go find memoirs or blog posts or Instagram, whatever you want, from people who are also autistic. Because in my experience, the internal experience of being neurodivergent is drastically different from like the list of diagnosis criteria you're going to get when you Google. So don't just look at the diagnosis criteria are important. I'm not trying to be completely dismissive, but that it's important to get that kind of real person experience if you can. And so if you think you might be ADHD, try to find other people who are ADHD. There's Facebook groups, there's all sorts of online groups. There's, a lot of people doing support groups on Zoom now. There might be people in your community. There probably are. So go find them and talk to them. And then if you still think that you might be neurodivergent, at that point, I would totally go see a professional. You can, at least in the United States, and I know it varies widely around the world. In the United States, you can get diagnosed or at least start the process for most neurodivergencies through your primary care physician. You can go to a therapist. Some social workers can diagnose you depending on the
type of neurodivergence.
On the type of I just completely lost the word. Some social workers can diagnose you depending on the circumstance. That's what I was going for. And also, if you have access to like a neuropsychiatrist, they are the people who know what all the neurodivergences look like and can say, oh, you're autistic and ADHD, or oh, you're bipolar, or you're borderline personality, or whatever it is. So neuropsychs are my favorite. I'll just say it. But, an MD can often just diagnose you too. And for me, I mean, having someone else say, I also see this in you, can be really validating and huge. Does it need to be a medical professional? It's kind of up to you. Like it's what you want. A lot of the interventions as an adult for autism or ADHD are things like social support, emotional intelligence support. Sometimes occupational therapy is like the one kind of movement-based therapy that can be helpful. But the process for adults is very different than for kids, and the interventions are very different. And so for me, the pros of being diagnosed as an adult are mostly for your own validation and your own recognition that you're not alone. There are other people like you. And we have some tips and tricks to make your life easier, and that's kind of the thing that I think is most valuable. Like at some autistics or ADHDers do really well with medication. You obviously need a diagnosis for that. Some of us need additional therapeutic support, and, getting a diagnosis and then going to therapy can be really helpful. So there are lots of reasons. I lean towards check it out if you might be interested in it. If you don't want to, that's fine. That's a personal decision. You're not going to harm yourself by not getting diagnosed in most cases. But in a lot of cases, there's a lot of benefits that are available to you by knowing who you are and what your brain type is like. So I say go for it.
No, cool. No, it makes sense to me, but I know it's a scary thing for a lot of people to do.
It is.
And I always like that someone who's gone for it's the same as what you were saying. I mean, I'm essentially a postnatal, physically at least, I'm a postnatal expert. Yeah. But I'm still a middle-aged white guy. I have not gone through the experience of giving birth and all that sort of stuff. So I can heal a lot of things with regards to diastasis recti and back problems and neck problems and all that sort of stuff. However, that is different from being able to offer support. Yeah. As in being able to, I can give you some hints and tips because I've done this for 10, 15 years, and therefore I've picked up a lot of stuff because I listen to people. But I can't say, well, what really worked for me, because that is not a thing. And therefore I like to hear people that have gone through it say, well, actually, you know what, this was a good idea for me and this really worked for me or it didn't, right?
Yeah, that's also important.
Because if you say it was a valuable experience for you, it might just make somebody else think, this could also be a valuable experience for me. Whereas if I say, by the way, guys, if you think there's something wrong, get it checked out. People just, you know nothing, you jackass. You have you have nothing to back that up.
Yeah. And I'll also just say, it's getting better, but a lot of medical professionals are not neurodivergent right now, at least in the US. And if it's not always possible also to, you might not always have access to the right kind of professional. And so that's why I say you want to take care of yourself. And I will say that some neurodivergences look the same as other ones. So there's a lot of traits in common, say, between autism, ADHD, borderline personality. So it is worth getting checked by an actual medical professional just to make sure that you're on the right track.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yes.
You know, you don't want to be doing interventions for autism if you're actually borderline personality, right? But that said, the professional themselves probably only has that kind of professional background in what autism looks like, right? And they probably haven't actually met a huge variety of autistic people in their life, right? Most people. And so going and talking to real autistic people gives you a much better sense of what autism can actually look like and the diversity in the population, right? And so that's why I'm saying, like, do both if you can, right? That both sides are important, right? And same for ADHD and same for anything else, that coming from people who know your experience will be most able to help you with kind of the day-to-day life experience of being autistic, right?
Yeah.
Whereas your doctor is going to be able to help you know, like, exactly what neurodivergence and what treatment options there might be medically for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is kind of exactly what I can diagnose and I can heal, but I can't share life experience. I can't hints and tips and I can't, for want of a better word, see, I just had it. I just had
it crossed the lines.
It's still stuck in my head. I can't share the experience. I can't share my experience with, and I think that is definitely when you're talking about something, about anything, it's definitely valuable to have both sides of the same thing. So obviously, do you, by the way, and I should have asked, do you do, because obviously you have neurodiverging.com and you do coaching and all that sort of stuff. Do you do that online, just in case people are?
Yeah, I do.
Because people are wondering in the UK, because the next question is always when you say, talk to people who know what they're talking about, or go online. Yeah, but online is a nightmare, right?
It's huge.
Google is too much, and there are a lot of, I always say there are a lot of shysters with better SEO, with better search engine optimization.
It's completely true. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, and also, you know, the people who can afford good SEO are not the actual autistics on the ground.
Exactly.
So, so I run neurodiverging.com and I have the Neurodiverging podcast, and I try to make resources for neurodivergent families. And that can be families where you have mixed neurotypes, right? Some of you are neurotypical and some of you are neurodivergent. So I have resources there in terms of like links of other places that I actually recommend my clients go. I also work with families as a parent coach and as a life coach. And I'm online, so I work worldwide. Cool. And I'm happy. And also if you have general questions, if you just email me, like, what are some places that I can learn about autism from? I am happy to email you back. Like, I feel like that's kind of my job, and what I'm here for is I want to help people not have to go through what I went through when I was a young mom. So people can come on to neurodiverging.com and just email me your questions. I will write you back or link you to resources or whatever. So
see, that's awesome, because that's the same thing I do. I always tell people, email me. I'm not going to sell you anything. No. Don't worry about it. Just send me an email if you have a question, because I don't want you finding everything out for, and air quotes again, finding everything out for yourself by listening to the wrong people, or just ending up in a whole heap and wasting time, especially because, let's be honest, time is a rather valuable resource. I will put, of course, all your information on the podcast description just for my listeners so they can find you.
Thank you.
And that is where we left it. Actually, after that, it turned to pure beautiful chaos. But I had to edit that last little bit out. So where can you find Danielle? Like I said, I love this interview. She's very happy taking emails and questions and all that sort of stuff, like I always do for HPMB as well. And, so get in touch with her. She's obviously, I will link to all her YouTube and her podcast and all that sort of stuff. But go to neurodiverging.com/life coaching, or just neurodiverging.com is where you can find her. Like I said, everything is in the podcast description. I'm very, very grateful indeed that she came onto the podcast. I thought we had a great chat. Like I said, I learned more in this past hour than I could have done in 10 years of or 10, 12 hours of looking at stuff on Google and YouTube and all that sort of stuff. And, as always, as I always say, I love it when I have expert guests on that can explain something to a simple minded person such as myself. For people who are neurodivergent, who are listening to this saying, Pete, you use the wrong words a lot. Yeah, I know. I'm 47. I'm doing my best. Right? I'm learning. It's a learning experience for me as well. I didn't mean to offend anyone if they... but of course, as always, peter@healthypostnatalbody.com if you do have something to say or you have any feedback, right? That's what I'm here for. Do we have an in the news this week? I'm sure we do. Yes, indeed we do. This is a study I came across, an article I came across on the 17th of Feb when it just came out by the Stanford University School of Medicine. But I saved it up for this particular podcast because, it made sense because it all ties in. Basically, girls with autism differ in several brain centers compared to boys with autism, which is really interesting because it suggests that a gender-specific diagnostics are needed. So what they did, they scanned the brain of almost 1,000 kids. Where did I find the number? Jesus, Pete. What are you doing? 976 brain scans from typically developing boys and girls, and they found that the algorithm can't distinguish between neurotypical boys and girls if it's if they don't have autism, so they're neurotypical. What we just spoke about. The algorithm can't see a difference between boys and girls, but as soon as you test it on neurodivergent, in this case autistic boys and girls, in this case they picked 773 children with autism, 637 boys, 136 girls, and the algorithm picked it up clearly. So that shows that when boys and girls are neurodivergent, the brain compartmentalization, so to speak, is different. And that also means that autism presents in a different way between males and females, right? Girls with autism generally have fewer, what they call overt repetitive behavior than boys and all that sort of stuff. And therefore, boys tend to get picked up earlier, that they have boys with autism, that diagnosis tends to get picked up earlier. And it turns out it might just be that we're looking for the wrong things. It's a fascinating little study because it just shows you how it links nicely into what I talk about a lot more, that you cannot treat men and women in exactly the same way because they're not exactly the same when it comes to biology and the makeup of the body and all that sort of stuff. So you have to treat it's slightly different. And this is yet another example where the medical community tends to focus on boys and men and all that sort of stuff, and then says, and therefore girls must be similar, and they miss girls, and therefore girls are at a slight disadvantage, because the earlier you diagnose stuff like that, the better you can treat it or deal with it or give the support parents need and children need. Anyways, I've linked to it. Like I said, I liked it. I thought it was just yet another interesting little study that was done. Obviously, I've linked to the article, which is easier to read, and I've linked to the study as well, which is a bit more difficult to read, but the conclusions are fairly straightforward. Anyways, that's it for this week. Next week, what are we doing next week? Next week, I have an interview lined up with, we're talking about anorexia and eating disorders next week. And all that sort of thing. Yeah, I know, heavy, right? It'll be fun. It'll be better than that. It'll be more exciting than it sounds, I promise. You have a tremendous week. I'll check in on you next week. As always, peter@healthypostnatalbody.com. If you have anything you'd like me to tackle, or anything you'd like to write in about, or questions you'd like to ask, just get in touch, right? You take care of yourself. Have a great week. And I'll be back next week. Bye now.